I am very honored to be joined by Stuart Taylor, Jr., author, journalist, Brookings Institution non-resident senior fellow, a National Journal contributing editor, who's written just a fascinating piece in Forbes about a slush fund, an Obamacare slush fund, which speaks to a broader lobbying situation, and we're going to get to that in a second. But let's say hello to Stuart. How are you, sir?
Very good. Thanks for having me on.
My pleasure.
Nice talking with you.
Nice to talk to you. Okay, before we get to that, I do want to ask you about the the scandals that are ongoing. Earlier in the show, we spoke to Jay Sekulow, the chief counsel of the American Center for Law and Justice, who's going ahead with a lawsuit. Right now, he has about 25 or 30 Tea Party groups and others. He says that's going to swell next week. But he said he doesn't want to see a special prosecutor yet. He wants the Congress to do their work. He wants to be able to do his work in the court. And he says a special prosecutor will put this behind closed doors, so to speak, for about a year or more, and that wouldn't be good. Where do you fall on this?
I think I agree with that. A congressional investigation is out in the open. The public finds out more about what happens sooner rather than later. A special prosecutor has a lot of problems. One is it all is in secret. Two is it kind of shuts down the special congressional investigation. Three, there may have been all kinds of malfeasance in office that's not criminal. You don't want to prosecute, a special prosecutor trying to put people in jail for doing things unless they're crimes. And the field of things that warrant public exposure and criticism is much larger than the fields of things that warrant special criminal prosecution. And we've had a history with special prosecutors in this country, investigating presidents of both parties. And something about the nature of that assignment tends to bring out the overzealousness in a person. Ken Starr is a friend of mine. I admire him. I think that happened to him. I think it happened to Lawrence Walsh when he was investigating the Democrats, with the previous Republican administration. And so I think unless and until there's some reason to think there is a criminal matter that we shouldn't trust the Justice Department with, I think leaving it to congressional investigations and hopefully media exposure is the best move. So I agree on that.
Okay, well, that's an interesting take. As far as you mentioned former special prosecutors, and of course, Nixon comes to mind and the others that you mentioned. But these scandals that are out there now, and you could mention them all or anyone in particular, are any of them, in your view, Nixonian?
Well, I'm not quite at the Nixonian stage. I think the Benghazi scandal is more about what happened after the deaths than before. It's hard protecting diplomats. They probably didn't do it all right. The real question there to me is whether it amounts to an organized campaign to falsify the record about what happened. And I think I'm not quite expert enough to have a strong opinion on that. I think the subpoenas of the media have a little bit of a tendency to scream bloody murder when the government does to them what it does to everyone else. And so I think there may have been, subpoenas may have gone too far, but I'm a little skeptical of the media outcry. I think the IRS may have been the worst in the sense that I'm not at all sure we're going to find that the White House knew about what the IRS was doing to the Tea Party groups early on. But in a way, as some have said, in a way, it's almost worse. It's pretty bad if it didn't, because if what you have is a bunch of bureaucrats who tend to be Democratic-leaning, left-leaning, members of public employee unions, not particularly friendly to the Republicans, and if their own best first instinct is leading them towards saying, let's really put the screws to the Tea Party groups, that's disturbing in itself, and if the administration is not riding herd on it, that's disturbing too.
Are you comfortable with the fact that the former head of the IRS, Doug Shulman, the White House logs show 157 visits, much more than Holder, than Hillary, than Geithner, and as compared to 4 years under the George Bush administration, there was one visit by the head of the IRS to the White House. As a matter of fact, the White House went out of its way, we learned today, to separate itself. He wasn't invited to Christmas parties or White House Easter egg rolls. Is that troubling?
That's obviously troubling, warrants intense investigation, and his effort to kiss it off by saying he took his kid to the Easter egg roll is almost contemptuous. Yeah, that he needs to be put on the stand and taken through. They need documents. They need to show documents that went on that had to do with his visits. That needs to be explored intensely. It's hard to think of a very good reason why the head of the IRS would be hanging out at the White House so much. I'm not ruling out the possibility, but certainly I wouldn't. It warrants very, very careful investigation.
And one
again,
more.
I think congressional investigation. Again, if you get a special prosecutor investigate it, you may hear 2 years from now that he decided no crimes were committed, and that may be all you hear.
Right, right. No, absolutely. And one more before we move on to your piece in Forbes. Eric Holder, with regard to his, I'm sure you probably heard the soundbite of the testimony he gave regarding the media, and then it turns out that he signed off on the subpoena against James Rosen. Do you believe that the talk of perjury is legitimate?
I doubt that he committed perjury. Perjury has to be a very specific false statement of fact. Just being a little bit of being somewhat misleading, even deliberately misleading, does not amount to perjury under the law. So I haven't parsed it, but and I don't even know if he was intentionally misleading. But I think perjury is not a real prospect here.
We're talking to Stuart Taylor here on the Steve Malzberg Show. All right, let's talk about this. The headline describes as a slush fund under Obamacare, a little noticed part of the Affordable Care Act. We're talking about $12.5 billion that gets put into some kind of prevention fund. Explain what this is all about.
Yeah, conservative critics call it a slush fund, and it's a useful term. It's pejorative, obviously, and I don't necessarily adopt it, but it's useful. What's troubling them about this fund? What's troubling them is that in 2010, Congress appropriated $2 billion a year forever, basically. Not subject to annual appropriations. It doesn't start at $2 billion. It's at about $1 billion a year now, and it'll get to $2 billion in 2022 and on forever, without Congress ever having another say in how it gets spent. Plus, it's, what's it going to be spent on? Pretty much prevention and public health, which is the name of the fund. That's it. Anything the administration thinks can be called prevention, as in disease prevention or public health, and that includes some things that seem a little bit silly, like massage therapists who offer calming techniques. But in a more troubling way, it includes arguably illegal use of federal funds to lobby state and local governments to impose higher state and local taxes on tobacco and soda, stricter zoning restrictions on fast food restaurants, and other legislation that these groups and the state health departments and the Department of Health and Human Services, that they think are good for public health. And putting aside the question whether they are good for public health, there's a law that says federal funds may not be used to lobby government at any level. And it's a very specific, very unambiguous, long-standing law. It's always been interpreted narrowly by the executive branch, but I write in my article that Secretary Sebelius and this administration have taken narrow interpretation to extremes, and they basically gutted this law and approved of programs that it seems to me violate its clear language.
I guess this is one of those things where, as Nancy Pelosi said, you had to pass the law to find out what's in it. Unfortunately, what's your take on the basic, the going to private entities for monies for the implementation of the Affordable Care Act by Sebelius and her department?
Seems to me pretty questionable. I doubt that there's a huge legality problem. May not be as clearly illegal as say some of these lobbying expenses are. But when a private company gets leaned on by the Secretary of Health and Human Services, they are thinking, well, what's she going to do to me if I don't do what she wants, and what can she do to help me if I do what she wants? And that's not the way government's supposed to work. Government is supposed to raise the funds to administer its programs from taxes, not from going around with hat in hand to big companies that have a stake in that government's policies.
And finally, with regard to the slush fund that you describe in your piece, what's been congressional reaction to that? Is there any attempt to rein that in?
Yes. Investigators in the House side, in particular, Representative Issa, chairman of the Oversight Committee, and Representative Fred Upton, chairman of Energy and Commerce, have been riding herd on on HHS and asking for documents and complaining that they're violating the law. The Inspector General of HHS is an independent, has been raising questions about whether they're violating the law. Even Tom Harkin, a Democratic loyalist senator, has been complaining about another use of this money to pay for the so-called administrative costs of the so-called insurance exchanges that are going to be created. The administration thinks they don't have enough money to get people to buy the insurance, so they want to dip into the public health fund and throw a little of that way, and Harkin's very bitter about that, as are some of the Republicans. The problem is that none of them can do much about this without a bipartisan agreement, which is not likely, because, and that's you get back to the name slush fund. When, Congress usually appropriates things from year to year. If they didn't like the way this money was being spent, they could say, sorry, no more money for that stuff next year. But the 2010 Act, the ObamaCare law, if you will, appropriated this money ad infinitum.
Yeah, it's perpetual.
It's like Medicaid or Medicare. It just keeps coming. No, Congress never gets a say in how it's spent.
Pretty amazing. Listen, Stuart, I hope you'll come back, sir. Fascinating conversation.
Nice talking to you.
Thank you. You too. Stuart Taylor, ladies and gentlemen, Brookings Institute non-resident senior fellow, National Journal contributing editor, author, journalist, and great piece at Forbes. You could probably see it at Forbes.